Let's open up to Ephesians together. It's been a little while since we've been in this regular study, and I've missed it. I've just been chomping at the bits to get back into Ephesians. It sort of worked out perfectly. We had about a month break for travel and guest speakers and such, and that break landed right in the middle of the book. So we've worked through already the first half of Ephesians, and that was the doctrinal half. You'll remember that I keep talking about there's two halves in this book. The first is doctrinal, the second is practical. And now we're about to enter the practical stage of this letter. Paul is about to build on everything he's just talked about, all the doctrine, all the deep, heavy truths of the Gentiles and the Jews being included in the same body, which is the church, which is a new revelation. It's a mystery that's been hinted at throughout the whole Old Testament and through the Gospels, and now it is reality, and now we get to see it in action, and Paul's excited about it. However, there are troubles within the church. And we're going to see today how Paul is exhorting the church here, who is made up of course, Jews and Gentiles. And they are all in the same body and yet are having trouble loving each other, having trouble working with each other in the same body. So that's the context here as we move into chapter 4. And this section really is the first 16 verses of chapter 4 is kind of one main argument. We're not obviously going to be able to get through 16 verses in 1 week, let alone 3 or 4 weeks. We're going to take this slow because there's so much in here, and I want to make sure we pick it all up as we go. But I do want to start by reading this whole section, verses 1 through 16 of chapter 4, because it is one argument, and I want you to see the flow. I would hate to get too close and too zoomed in under the microscope and then just miss the whole general flow of the passage. So let's start by reading these 16 verses, and then we'll back it up and we'll look at the first just 2 verses this morning. Ephesians 4, 1 to 16 says this: "Therefore I, the prisoner in the Lord, exhort you to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, being diligent to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There's one body and one Spirit, just as also you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore, it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive of hosts of captives, and he gave gifts to men." Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also descended to the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is himself also he who ascended far above all heavens, so that he might fulfill all things. And he himself gave some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain the unity of the faith and the full knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ, so that we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by the craftiness and deceitful scheming. But seeking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, that is Christ, from whom the whole body, being joined together and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the properly measured working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love." There's so much to unpack here. There's so much to apply, and it's going to take us probably a month or 2 to really work through this carefully. I don't want to leave any points on the field. I want to pick them all up and point out all these nuances that Paul's using here to make this big argument. But really, the big argument is this: the church is made up of a lot of different parts, and those parts don't always naturally get along. There's always friction when humans are involved, when sin is involved. And so here he's going to give us an exhortation to walk in such a manner, to live in such a manner with each other so that we can maintain unity and then build growth. That's the main point here. He wants the church, Ephesus, and then even by extension us, to have such a unity about us that we have growth as a result. We'll start this week looking at how Paul sets this foundation for this argument here in chapter 4. Just the first two verses here is where he sets the anchor, the foundation for this argument. And the key takeaway here is that if you want your local church to be healthy, if you want it to be strong and unified, you need to first and foremost focus on your own personal walk. That's the main point here in the first two verses. And we've all seen this firsthand, at least, or heard of local churches struggling to maintain unity, haven't we? I mean, perhaps you were even part of a church that struggled to maintain unity. Maybe it was even this church decades ago. It's a common theme in local churches to struggle to keep unity among the body. Divisions, sinful infighting, people taking their opinions and preferences and then asserting them on others and forcing them to agree with them on secondary issues. That just brings about fractures, and it often takes decades and decades to heal, if ever. And Paul here is concerned that that's going to happen here to the Ephesians. So he writes these two verses here, and really all of 1 through 16, to anchor this main argument that it ought not to be so. And there is a way to make it not so. There is a way to have unity and have growth and to find your church flourishing. If you want your church to be healthy and unified, you need to see to your own personal walk with the Lord, is his point. And so look at these first two verses here. This is all we're going to be able to get through this morning. But we're going to see Paul lay out in these first two verses 5 specific characteristics that need to define our spiritual lives if we're to have any hope of unity in this body. And this is where it gets really practical. You're already seeing it. I mean, this is where we can start thinking about how this works out in Doxa. This is how it works out in Indian Hills. This is how it works out in Lincoln. This is where the jump from the doctrine to the practice is a lot easier for me to make as a preacher because he's giving us point-blank exhortations. And so these 5 characteristics that he wants us to see here are to walk consistently, in verse 1, walk humbly, in verse 2, and then the rest of verse 2 gives us 3 more, to walk gently, to walk patiently, and then to walk enduringly. Consistently, humbly, gently, patiently, and enduringly. That is what Paul is focused on here in these first 2 verses. So let's start with verse 1, under the first heading, to walk consistently. That's his main point here in verse 1. Walk consistently. He says, therefore, I, the prisoner in the Lord, exhort you to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called. And I think that opening phrase there from Paul describes, as he describes himself, is really important for us to see and pick up on because it reveals something about Paul's fundamental view of himself. He calls himself what? The prisoner in the Lord. And we know that Paul wrote this letter from prison, right? He's in Rome, in prison, perhaps under house arrest at this point, and he is not in a good situation, socially speaking, physically speaking, circumstantially speaking. But notice how he doesn't draw attention to that. He doesn't draw attention to the physical location of his imprisonment. He's not saying, I'm a prisoner in Rome, or I'm a prisoner because of these Jews who turned me over to Rome. That's not what he's pointing at. He points at the fact that he is the prisoner in the Lord. That's how he describes this experience of being in prison, in the Lord. He's pointing to a bigger perspective here, just right out the gates. He points to the fact that he's in the situation in which he finds himself because of his allegiance to the Lord, to Christ in particular here. And this is perhaps Paul's most admirable trait. And once you see it, you can start seeing it throughout all of Paul's writings. He refuses to think about the events and the circumstances of his life in earthly terms. And I think that's just so admirable. It's hard to replicate, but it should be our goal to replicate it, shouldn't it be? His filter for how he thinks about his life is dominated not by the physical, not by the circumstantial, but by the spiritual. It's almost like he's wearing rose-colored glasses in a positive way, which cause him to see the world around him in terms of his relationship to God, not in his relationship to other people around him. He doesn't care as much about his relationship to the world. His relationship to the world is purely evangelistic, and he's going to die trying to get the gospel out to as many people as who will listen to him. But really, his main focus in this life is all layered on by the spiritual. He's a prisoner in the Lord. It was his commitment to obeying the Lord that even got him into this trouble, and so that's how he chooses to talk about it, spiritual terms. And I think there's a lesson there for us. You know, if our government continues to go the way it's going now, it's not so bad, and I highly doubt that any of us would be imprisoned for evangelism during our lifetimes. But we all have to live in this world, and we all are tempted to one degree or another to think of whatever circumstances we're in as defining us, right? We often think about the situation that we find ourselves in as indicative of who we are or how we are to be in this world. To one degree or another, we all feel a pull to follow our identities or to be wrapped up in defining ourselves by our circumstances. And maybe this is less true for women than for men, but what's the first question us guys always ask each other when we're getting to know each other? What do you do? What do you do for work? What's your job? Who are you? You know, and the answer is always, you know, well, I'm an electrician, or I'm a financial advisor, or I'm a farmer, or I'm a salesman, but I'm trying to get into management. And that's how we define ourselves, by what we do, by the circumstances in which we find ourselves, what God gave us to do right now in this moment. And of course, we have to have these occupations, and it is a helpful way of getting to know someone. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think it points to it could point to a deeper thinking issue with the way that we view even why we're here, right? Our understandings of ourselves can be defined by our earthly circumstances rather than our spiritual missions. You know, and Paul's example here is the opposite. You know, if you were to ask him what he does for a living, he'd probably say, well, you'd probably be frustrated with your question. And you say, well, tents. Yeah, I make tents so that I can make money, but that's really just a side hustle so that I can focus on what I'm here for, which is to share the gospel with the world. He's a tent maker, but he's a tent maker in Christ. He's a prisoner in the Lord. That's the significance of that phrasing there. He's a prisoner in the Lord. He refused to allow the circumstances to cloud his understanding of his identity. And then he says in the next phrase, after describing himself as a prisoner in the Lord, I exhort you to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called. And so here he's getting into the main point, right? He's identified himself. He's given us the spiritual overlay of who he thinks he is and why he's even talking, and his circumstances don't matter. He's just a prisoner in the Lord, and he's excited about it. And he's making a direct connection here now between one's salvation and then one's pattern of living. That's why he says, I exhort you to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called. And remember, his main point here, it's unity, peaceful solidarity in the local body, right? That's what he's trying to get at. And so his first exhortation is to walk worthy of the calling which got you into the circumstance in the first place of being in this body. The foundation for how we act in this life is found in our calling, in our salvation. That should be the overarching reason for why we act the way we act, why we do the way we do, why we think the way we think. The fundamental motivation for all that we do in this life as Christians is, of course, rooted in that fact that we are Christians. And he's saying the manner in which you walk through this life is anchored to the status as being a Christian. You have been called. That's why he writes, you need to walk worthy of that calling. And I think that phrasing, to walk worthy, it deserves a bit more of our attention. If you've done any studying of ancient Ephesus, or really any ancient Greco-Roman cities that were flourishing at about this time when Paul was writing, you'll remember that all of these cities had a centralized heartbeat of the city, which was called the agora, the marketplace. It was a place where all the farmers would come into the city, where all the people, and since Ephesus was a port city, all the seamen would come off the sea, dock, and there would be this massive situation in which people would trade commodities and goods and services so that they could all flourish better together, the marketplace, right? And so Paul's pulling on this here as he talks about walking worthy. And I'm giving you this background here because that word right there in the middle of verse 1, worthy, is the Greek word axios. And you can kind of hear the concept here, axios, axis, which would have called to the Ephesians' mind the mental image of a scale that would rest on an axis. That's what that word communicates, a scale. Like they would often see these scales in these agora. They'd be at every little stand, and sometimes they'd be centralized, and a few little stands would share the same scale so that they wouldn't all have to have their own. But these scales were really the lifeblood of how the agora worked, because without the scales, you wouldn't know if somebody was cheating you out of anything, right? And so some people, because there was no paper money, would actually shave little bits off the coins that they would use. You've probably heard this concept before. They would shave little bits off these coins so that you couldn't even tell visually. However, and you would barely even be able to tell if you put it on the scale, because they would try to do just a little bit at a time. And then eventually, after they had enough shavings, they could make a new coin or a new bar of precious metals. And so Paul's bringing to mind this scale that would keep that from happening, that deception from happening, to try to get the Ephesians here to understand that their lives are being measured on a scale. And the scale is their salvation on one side and their behavior on the other. That's what the word to walk worthy, axios, that's what that would bring to mind for these Ephesians. He's using this illustration of scales in the agora in Ephesus to communicate that our walks and our calling have to be of equal weight. You can't shave off little bits of your behavior if you're going to actually live and walk according to your calling. And he just spent 3 chapters, right, explaining the immensity and the value of the Christian's calling. I mean, just soaring truths of election, predestination, inheritance in the future. He's talked about salvation a lot, the calling to which they've been called, and now he's just saying, he's turning the corner, he's saying, all right, now act like it. It's on the scale on one side, now your behavior's on the other side. How's it going to stack up? He's putting the divine scale on the table here for them, and he puts their regeneration on one side, and then their behavior on the other side, their good works for which they've been saved. And it's really just, I think, a vivid method that Paul uses that we don't really get as much in the English, because that word axios, which is connected to the scale, just kind of falls through in the English. But that's what he's getting at here. And this isn't the only time that Paul makes this appeal to New Testament Christians. And you could jot down 1 Thessalonians 2:12, walk in a manner worthy of the God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. And then Colossians 1:10, walk in a manner worthy of the Lord to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work and multiplying in the full knowledge of God. Again, Philippians 1:27, live your lives in a manner worthy, axios, of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come to see you or you remain absent, I will hear about your circumstances, that you are standing firm in the one Spirit, with one mind, contending together for the faith of the gospel. You even see it there in Philippians 1:27. To walk worthy, to walk axios, is to necessarily breed unity in the church. They're connected. And then here in Ephesians 4:1, to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called. So the standard of our actions, Paul's saying, the standard of the actions of those who've been called must stack up to the actual calling itself. And if we're going to live and function in a local church body together in unity, Paul's saying then we have to live in such a way as to stack up to our callings. So that's why Paul sets this standard of living for someone who's been called. If you've been called, you need to walk worthy of that calling, behave according to your new nature. Don't get caught up in the trappings of your old life. That would make no sense, and it would tip the scales incorrectly. Live fully and consistently, Paul says, according to your calling. And that's his main point here. And now in verse 2, he builds on this. He goes into more detail by explaining some of the features to help us remember how to walk according to our calling. And then there in verse 2, you see, walk humbly. He tells us with all humility. Consistency is humility. One of the more interesting facts I learned this week when I was studying is that the original word here used for this concept of humility didn't actually exist before the New Testament writings. You know, it's one of those words that, there's a few of them in the New Testament. It's one of them that just didn't exist before because there's no need to talk about this concept. Humility, in essence, is a brand new concept come after Christ when Paul's writing and the apostles are writing. There was no need to even have a word to describe this lowliness, this self-reflective weakness almost. There was just no point for that word because the world didn't understand that. And I think that's just a funny etymological fact, that it's a new word to describe a new thing that Christ brought about by his example, ultimately. His example of humility, and then the need, his exhortation to Christians who are little Christs, to follow his example of humility. Being lowly and viewing yourself as less than, as weak in relation to something strong. The unbelieving world just looks at this concept of being humble and says, that's a joke. We don't even need a word for that. To them, being humble isn't respectable. It's not something to cultivate in your personality. Considering yourself to be not important is ridiculous to the world, and it's a recipe for just losing the respect of others around you. But for the Christian, humility is a key character trait, isn't it? Christ made that super clear to us. And this concept was so foreign to the world that they just didn't even talk about it at all. So we have this word humility, and it means to consider yourself lowly or insignificant. It's one of the most fundamental characteristics of a believer. You know, humble people don't puff up their chests and flex their muscles and spout off how great they are. Humble believers have something about them that minimizes themselves. And whatever strengths they might have, they're not pointing to. They're not emphasizing their strengths. They're maximizing Christ, who is the source of those strengths. We have a right view of where we get strengths, and we have a very deep understanding of our weaknesses. That's just the essence of the Christian mindset. And that's what Paul's trying to get at here. But it's easy to talk about humility, right? And it's really one of the most, and if not the most difficult elements in the Christian life to actually achieve, right? The common joke is once you think you've got humility, you just lost it because you just demonstrated pride in finding humility. Right? It's so elusive. Once you kill pride, you're proud about killing pride, and then you're prideful all over again. Once you finally dominate that pride, you've just cultivated more of it. But just because it's hard to cultivate, it doesn't mean that it's not important. And Paul is saying, yes, it's hard. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's always going to be elusive to you. However, it's important for unity in particular. You need to find humility. You need to cultivate humility. It's foundational to unity. And he says, basically, next to actually being saved, which is what he's just talked about, being called so that you have a chance at walking worthy of the calling. Next to that, the most important element in your own personal walk for promoting and preserving unity in the local body is humility. Humility leads to healthy relationships because there's no chance for friction when you're humble. There's no chance for offense. You know, think of the most humble person you've ever met, whoever that is in your life. Isn't it just so hard to even actually get into an argument with this person? I mean, there's no friction in this relationship because they're so humble. They're unwilling to be offended about things. They're unwilling to give offense about things. And at the very least, I think this humility, pride, on the other hand, it's the opposite. It adds friction to a relationship. It increases the tension. And at the very least, it causes people to be annoyed with you for a little while. But at the worst, it's like a grenade or a bomb just exploding in a church body, right? I mean, to have pride, especially a leader who is prideful in the church, just is like a grenade, and the shrapnel just goes everywhere in the church. And it hurts people, it cuts people. That's pride and humility. And so humility produces unity, and then pride obviously is the opposite. And this is one of the reasons that the Gospels are so important, because Christ is the ultimate example of humility. We wouldn't know what humility is if we didn't have Christ. Think about that. Just like we wouldn't know what true love is without Christ's love and the Father's love being demonstrated to us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's the definition of love. We wouldn't even know what humility is. There was no word for it before Christ. In fact, let's flip over and look at Luke 22. Flip over with me to Luke 22. Jesse will be here in about 15 years. Luke 22. There's so many places we could go to see this humility in Christ. The humility of the incarnation we could see, the humble birth and upbringing of Christ, his poverty, his discomfort throughout his ministry where he couldn't even lay his head. He had no place to lay his head. We could talk about the washing of the disciples' feet, his suffering and death on the cross. But just reading through any of the Gospels is a lesson in humility. But here in Luke 22, I want us to focus on this point in particular because he teaches a profound lesson here. It's not just an example, it's also a lesson. Luke 22, look at 24. He's going to teach the disciples this lesson. And there arose also a dispute among them, the disciples, as to which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest. So what do we see here, right? Pride causing friction. Pride in relationships, in community, causes friction. Considering oneself with high regard causes trouble in a small community. And that's what's happening here. There arose a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be the greatest. And then Jesus said to them, the kings and the Gentiles lord it over them, pointing to the world. And those who have authority over them are called benefactors. If you want to be prideful, you look more like the world. But not so with you. Rather, the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. He's showing them the upside downness of this new humble way of thinking. Or I guess we could more accurately say how their original way of thinking, which is to vie for the top spot, was upside down, and he's trying to right-size that understanding of how they view themselves. And he makes it a little bit more tangible for them here as we continue. He says, for who is greater? The one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? And obviously the disciples in their old way of thinking would say, well, the one who's reclining at table, he's being served, he's greater. Is not the one who reclines, Jesus says, flipping the script on them, but I am among you as the one who serves. He's showing his example. And then obviously we can look through a number of different examples of how he did this. Washing their feet is one vivid example. Jesus showed them that true leadership, true healthy community, true humility is servitude. It's viewing oneself as less than the others so that you can promote unity. He's the ultimate example of unity, Christ is. And he requires, of course, that his followers cultivate that same attitude. You can flip back to Ephesians 4. Let's look at the second part of verse 2. Second part of verse 2. He says, therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, exhort you to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called, with all humility. And now he adds one more, and gentleness. This one's almost a synonym of humility, really, gentleness. And so Paul just connects them with the and. And this effectively makes them two sides to one coin, in essence. They're almost synonyms here. Humility is something that we cultivate in our minds, primarily as we battle pride and as we seek to promote unity in the church. But gentleness is something that's less in your mind and less an internal battle. It's more of a relational element here. So it's kind of like the same thing, but acted out in relation. That's the sense here. Gentleness is defined by relation. It's seen most clearly when it's demonstrated in the context of interacting with another person. Humility is personal, gentleness is relational. And I really like how one commentator that I read this week defined this concept of gentleness. He said, the man who is gentle is the man who's always angry at the right time and never angry at the wrong time. The one who's gentle is always angry at the right time and never angry at the wrong time. I think that hits the nail on the head. Because gentleness is not weakness. The world would look in at what we're talking about here and think, that's just that pastor telling them all to be weak and frail because pride is really how you are strong. But that's not true. We're not to be weak and frail. Gentleness is different. It's properly timed anger. And in the inverse, it's more defined. It's properly timed passivity. It's letting things go, in a sense. What Paul wants the Ephesians to see here is well-timed peacefulness. Soft when the situation calls for it, and yet stern when it's needed. That's the idea of gentleness here. Another commentator I read offered the illustration of a well-trained dog, right? A growling and an unyielding dog would act that way to the owner's enemies. However, to the owner's friends, the dog would be peaceful. That's gentleness. It's gentleness toward those who you are at peace with, and growling and unyielding truth, defining to those who disagree. Not weak, but gentle. And remember, Jesus wasn't weak, right? I mean, he cleared the temple. He displayed the most pure form of righteous anger that we have on a human scale. But to his sheep, what does he do? How does he talk? He offers his yoke, and he promised to be gentle in heart so that they can find rest for their souls. Strong where it needs to be strong, and peaceful where it needs to be peaceful. That's gentleness. Then he mentions patience, which is our fourth characteristic here, patience. We need to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, and with patience. And so here, he is building again on this concept of gentleness. Really, each one of these is like a step that has an element of the past one, but introduces a new element. This here, patience, is a withholding of one's wrath and maintaining a hope for reconciliation with a person. And there are a number of examples we could use and we could look at, but the best one is, of course, what? God. God is the most patient. The Father is most patient with us. I mean, we sinned against him. There's nothing more egregious. There's nothing more brutal. There's nothing more deserving of wrath. And yet, Romans 2:4, or do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness or the forbearance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads to your repentance? It was God's patience with us that led us to repentance, and it's the ultimate display of his glory in our salvation. It's because of his patience. And how often do we jump to conclusions when we feel wronged in the church, when we feel wronged in our family context? When somebody says something or does something to hurt us, we feel justified in harboring bitterness, and we don't let it go easily. That's the opposite of what Paul's trying to get at here. That's not patient. We need to hold on to hope that the offense will be corrected and the forgiveness will be sought. Even if that happens or not, it doesn't matter. That's a secondary issue. But patience is something that withholds wrath and expects and hopes for reconciliation, despite that person may not, even though they may not be interested in reconciliation. That's a secondary issue. Patience here has nothing to do with the way they're acting, but everything to do with the way you are responding to the offense. And so the image here is one of like an infinitely long fuse. If you're the bomb, well, the fuse has just got to be so long that you'll never actually explode in the context of the church. And in the church, when it comes to the way we interact with each other, when we offend each other, when we sin against each other, we have this default presupposition that we are committed to unity. And no matter what you can do to me or what I can do to you, it doesn't matter. We are unified, and we're going to figure this out as a unit. That's the image here. That's what Paul wants the Ephesians to adopt. Yes, there are Jews in this congregation. There are Gentiles in this congregation. It's really hard for them to mix. It's a lot easier for us to mix, by the way, because we're in the same culture at least. It's really hard for these two groups to mix, and yet he's saying, be unified, have patience with one another. If someone wrongs you, it's okay. It's going to happen. Commit to unity, and therefore withhold your wrath. That's the idea of patience. And then finally, he coalesces all of this into one character trait here at the end of verse 2, and he phrases it this way: bearing with one another in love. Remember, he's building on each one, adds a new element each time. However, they're all very similar. Now he adds bearing with one another in love. And the concept here is one that we would have such a commitment to the long-term goal of being a unified body and honoring God in our unity that we're willing to bear with each other through interpersonal differences. That's the idea here. We're so committed to the long-term goal of unity. We're thinking 100 years from now, we want this church, Indian Hills, to be solid and unified, right? We want our great-grandchildren, if the Lord tarries, to have a solid church here in Lincoln, Nebraska, Lord willing, even in this building, so that they can be healthy and strong. And the way that I interact with you today when you offended me is going to affect that. So I'm going to be so focused on that goal that I'm going to bear with you in love. That's the perspective here. He's getting them to zoom out and say, hey, listen, Ephesus, yeah, this is a new church, but Lord willing, it's going to last centuries. And we don't know exactly how long it lasted. It doesn't exist today because the town was flooded. Maybe the church died before that. But he's saying, look beyond your current situation, the current offense that you're so wrapped up in, and love in spite of it. Love, of course, we know is tested in adversity. I mean, love is not that naive infatuation that Hallmark wants us to believe it is. You know, it's not the feeling of butterflies in the stomach when you see the other person like Disney wants us to think it is. No, biblical love is what? It's a commitment to care for each other in the face of offense, in the face of hurt, in the face of pain, in the face of confusion and rumors. And Paul anchors this list of characteristics here with love because he knows that it's perhaps the most important element, the most overarching element, that if we have, then we have hope of actually being unified long term. Remember the church in Ephesus was made up of these two groups of people that just hated each other pre-Christ. And even were tempted to hate each other post-Christ in their new salvation, in their calling. And he's saying, don't walk like that anymore. You can't. You need to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called, and that means love. That means bearing with one another. That means patience with one another. Loving each other even though you don't necessarily like each other, Paul says. And you know the chapter, the love chapter in 1 Corinthians. I won't read it all for the sake of time, but I just want to mention, read a few snippets. Love is patient. Love is kind. It's not jealous. It doesn't brag. Think about this in the context of the church, among each other here, and among the people in the other classrooms, and that we're all going to be together in that auditorium in just a few minutes. Think about those people. Are you patient with them? Are you kind with them? Are you not jealous with them? Do you not brag with them? Do you not get puffed up with them? Love does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. It's not provoked. It does not take into account a wrong suffered. It does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. He ends that section, that chapter, in 1 Corinthians 13. But now abide faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And so that's the main point here. We're going to get into all the other nuances of this argument here, but he's setting the foundation this week with the first two verses. Love is fuel for longevity in unity. If that's all you're getting from this, that's fine. Just circle love and then point back to all these other ones, because you will be able to bear with one another if you have love. You'll be able to have humility if you have love. You'll be able to have gentleness if you have love. You'll be able to have patience if you have love. You'll be able to walk worthy of the calling with which you've been called if you have love. Love is the fuel for longevity in unity in the body. It's the stuff that makes the church healthy. It's what we all need to cultivate if we're going to make even this church healthy. With that, let's pray, and we'll move into the next section next week. Heavenly Father, God, thank you for loving us, defining love, defining patience, defining humility, defining bearing with one another. You did all of this by giving us Christ as an example and giving us the Gospels and the record of the Son and his example of all these things to us. God, may we lock into this. May we commit to this. May we commit to loving one another because you called us to, because you called us to this salvation. God, that's what we want. That's what we want to do. We want this church to be healthy, unified, and ultimately loving. Please help us to do that. Let these words sink in your name.